Well, the title of my talk is Writing an Autobiography. Are you still writing? He asked. I am, I answered. What are you working on at the moment? An autobiography, I said. Interesting, he replied. Whose? The implication here, you will note, is that mine hasn't been a life sufficiently interesting to merit an autobiography. The implication isn't altogether foolish. Most autobiographies, at least the best autobiographies, have been written by people who themselves have historical standing, or have known many important people, or have lived in significant times, or have noteworthy family connections or serious lessons to convey. I qualify on none of these grounds. Not that roughly 2 years ago, when I sat down to write my own autobiography, I allowed this to stop me. Autobiography, to state the obvious, is at base a person writing his own biography. But how is one to write it? As a matter of setting the record straight, as a form of confessional, as a mode of seeking justice or justification for one's own life? Autobiography, wrote George Orwell, is only to be trusted when it reveals something disgraceful. A man who gives a good account of himself is probably lying, since any life, when viewed from the inside, is simply a series of defeats. Is this true? I prefer to think not. Autobiography is, of course, a complex enterprise, calling for its author not only to know himself, but to be honest in conveying that knowledge. I could inform the dullest author how he might write an interesting book, wrote Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Let him relate the events of his own life with honesty, not disguising the feelings that accompanied them. One of the nice things about being a professor, it has been said, is that one gets to talk for 50 minutes without being interrupted. So one of the allurements of autobiography is that one gets to write scores of pages about that eminently fascinating character, oneself, even if in doing so, one only establishes one's insignificance. The great autobiographies, of which there have been not all that many, have been wildly various. One of the first is that of the Renaissance sculptor Benvenuto Cellini, which is marked by an almost unrelieved braggadocio. No artist was more perfect, no warrior more brave, lover more pleasing than the author, or so he, Cellini, would have us believe. Edward Gibbon's autobiography, though beautifully written, is disappointing in its brevity. That of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, heavily striking the confessional note, might have been told in a booth to a priest. Ben Franklin's autobiography is full of advice on how the rest of us should live. John Stuart Mill's is astounding in its account of its author's prodigiously early education, taking up Greek under his father's instruction at the age of 3. Then there is Henry Adams' autobiography, which is suffused with disappointment about feeling out of joint with his, Adams' times, and the world not recognizing his true value. In making it, Norman Podhoretz wrote an autobiography informed by a single message, which he termed a dirty little secret. The secret being, there's nothing wrong with ambition, and that success, apart from what leftist intellectuals might claim, is nothing to be ashamed of. Please note that all of these books were written by men. Might it be that women lack the vanity required to write, or should I say indulge in, the literary act of autobiography? In Mary Beard's Emperor of Rome, I recently read that Agrippina, the mother of Nero, wrote her autobiography, which has not survived, and which Mary Beard counts as one of the great losses of all classical literature. I wish that Jane Austen had written an autobiography, and so too George Eliot and Willa Cather. Perhaps these three women, great writers all, were too sensibly modest for autobiography, that least modest of all literary forms. Autobiography can be the making or breaking of writers who attempt it. John Stuart Mill's autobiography has gone a long way toward humanizing a writer whose other writings tend to be coldly formal. Harold Lasky wrote that Mill's, quote, autobiography, in the end, the most imperishable of his writings, is a record as noble as any in our literature of consistent devotion to the public good. If John Stuart Mill's autobiography humanized him, the autobiography of Anthony Trollope did something of the reverse for him. In his An Autobiography, Trollope disdains the notion of authors needing inspiration to write well. He reports that, quote, there was no day on which it was not my positive duty to write for the publishers as it was my duty to write reports for the post office, where Trollope had a regular job. I was free to be idle if I pleased, but I had made up my mind to undertake this second profession, that of novelist. I found it expedient to bind myself by certain self-imposed laws. Trollope recounts, emphasis here on counts, that as a novelist he tended to average 40 pages a week at 250 words a page. He writes, there are those who would be ashamed to subject themselves to such a taskmaster and who think that a man who works with his imagination should allow himself to wait till inspiration moves him. When I have heard such doctrine preached, I have hardly been able to repress my scorn. Trollope then goes on to mention that the day after he finished his novel, Dr. Thorne, he began writing his next novel, The Bertrams. For a long spell, the literati refused to forgive Trollope for shearing inspiration away from the creation of literary art, for comparing the job of the novelist to a job at the post office. Only the splendid quality of his many novels eventually won forgiveness and proper recognition for Anthony Trollope. A serious biography takes up what the world thinks of its subject, what his friends and family think of him, and if available, through letters, diaries, journals, or interviews, what he thinks of himself. An autobiography is ultimately about the last, what an author thinks of himself. Yet how many of us have sufficient knowledge to bring this off convincingly? In her splendid novel, Memoirs of Hadrian, Marguerite Yourcenar has Hadrian note, when I seek deep within me for knowledge of myself, what I find is obscure, internal, unformulated, and as secret as any complicity. The unexamined life may not be worth living, but the scrupulously observed one is rare. My own life, I must say, has not provided the richest fodder for autobiography. For one thing, it has not provided much in the way of drama. For another, good fortune has allowed me the freedom to do much as I have pleased with my life. I have given my autobiography the title, Never Say You've Had a Lucky Life, with the subtitle, Especially If You've Had a Lucky Life. Now well along in its closing chapter, mine, I contend, has been thus far, and here I pause to knock wood, a most lucky life. My title derives from the story of Croesus, who ruled the country of Lydia from circa 585 BC to 547 BCE, and it was perhaps today best known for the phrase, rich as Croesus. The vastly wealthy Croesus thought himself the luckiest man on earth, and asked confirmation of this from Solon, the wise Athenian, who told him that another Athenian who had 2 sons in that year's Olympics was in fact the luckiest man on earth. When Croesus asked who was second luckiest, Solon cited another Greek who had a most happy family life. Croesus was displeased, but not convinced by Solon's answers. Years later, he, Croesus, was captured by the Persian Cyrus, divested of his kingdom and wealth, and set on a pyre to be burned alive. Solon, you were right, were said to be the last words he uttered. The moral of the story, of course, is never say you've had a lucky life until you know how your own life ends. Now, I have known sadness in my life. I have undergone a divorce. I have become a member of that most dolorous of clubs, parents who have buried one of their children. Yet up to now, I have had much to be grateful for. In the final paragraph of a book I wrote some years ago on the subject of ambition, I noted, quote, "We do not choose our parents, we do not choose our historical epoch or the country of our birth or the immediate circumstances of our upbringing. In all these realms, I lucked out. I was born to intelligent, kindly parents at a time that, though I was drafted into the peacetime army, allowed me to miss being called up to fight in any wars, and in the largely unmitigated prosperity enjoyed by the world's most interesting country, the United States of America." The novelist E.M. Forster said, "How do I know what I think until I write about it?" Which is another way of saying that writing is an act of discovery. Yet can even writing ferret out the quality and meaning of one's own life? Alexis de Tocqueville, the endlessly quotable Tocqueville, wrote, quote, "The fate of individuals is still more hidden than that of peoples, and the destinies of individuals are often as uncertain as that of nations." Fate, destiny, those two great tricksters, who knows what they have in store for one, even up to the final days of one's life. I, for example, as late as the age of 18, had never heard the word intellectual. If you had asked me what a man of letters was, I would have said a guy who works at the post office. Yet I have been destined myself to function as an intellectual for the better part of my adult life, and have more than once been called a man of letters. Fate, destiny, go figure. The first question that arises in writing one's autobiography is what to include, what exclude. Take, for starters, sex. In his nearly 700-page autobiography, Journeys of the Mind, the historian of late antiquity, Peter Brown, waits until page 581 to mention, in the most glancing way, that he is married. 40 or so pages later, the name of a second wife is mentioned. Whether he had children with either of these wives, we never learn. But then Peter Brown's is a purely intellectual autobiography concerned exclusively with the development of the author's mind and those who influence that development. My autobiography, the less than half the length of Peter Brown's, allowed no such luxury of reticence. Sex, especially when I was an adolescent, was a central subject, close to a preoccupation. After all, boys, as I instructed my beautiful granddaughter Annabelle when she was growing up, boys are brutes. I came of age BP, or before the pill, and consummated sex, known in that day as going all the way, was not then a serious possibility. Too much was at risk: pregnancy, loss of reputation for middle-class girls. I like to think of myself as a shy pornographer, or perhaps better, a sly pornographer. By this I mean that in my fiction, and where necessary in my essays, I do not shy away from the subject of sex, only from the need to describe it in any of its lurid details. So I have done in my autobiography. On the subject of sex in my first marriage of two, for example, I merely say, I did not want my money back. But then sex, if one comes to think about it, is essentially, all sex, if one comes to think about it, is essentially comic, except of course one's own. Still on the inclusion-exclusion question, the next subject I had to consider was money, or my personal finances. Financially, I have nothing to brag about. In my autobiography, I do, though, occasionally give the exact amount of salaries, none of them spectacular, of the jobs I've held. With some hesitation lest it seem boasting, I mentioned that a book I wrote on the subject of snobbery earned, with its paperback sale, roughly $500,000. I failed to mention those of my books that earned paltry royalties, or as I came to think of them, peasantries. In my autobiography, I content myself with noting my good fortune in being able to earn enough money doing pretty much what I wish to do and ending up having acquired enough money not to worry overmuch about financial matters. Like the man said, a lucky life.